Hi, my name is Bob Francis, and this is a broadcast of the talk I gave at the May 11th in-print meeting at the Cherry Valley Library. So if you did attend that meeting and did see me standing up there going through this presentation, it is okay to turn it off right now. For those of you who didn't see it, hopefully this will be a good introduction to what needs to happen now that you have volunteered for the in-print radio show that we're putting together. So when you signed up to be a volunteer for the in-print radio show, I asked what aspects of the show would you be interested in? Would you be interested in technical, being an interviewer, being a guest, reading your work, or reading someone else's work? And so we'll be going through all of those aspects, and what I expect you to do, give you some samples to hopefully start getting through the practical matter of actually doing our first interviews and our first shows. So let me show you where this is and what we've been asked to do. This is a website, and it's www.live365.com. Then there's a place you can look up the radio stations, and in this case, this station is called Rockford College Radio. And this streams out live, so you could go ahead and play this right now. You can have an app on your phone, and you can listen to what's going on. This is the main website, which is www.rockfordcollegeradio.com. And we can look at the schedule here. What we're going to do is have a show. There we go. Sometime we'll have an hour-long show sometime in this area that we'll be having a show about writing. That has been what we've been asked to do. It has to do with writing. And other than that, anything goes. And so we'll have a show that'll show up somewhere in here. Then we'll be listed here and have a home page. You can click for podcast because once our show has aired in the day part, so if we're Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, after that, then it'll show up in the list of available podcasts. And you can see all the ones that are available. This is just on the RockfordCollegeRadio.com website. We'll also have links to it from the in-print website. We'll be mentioning it in our Facebook feed. We'll probably mention it in the newsletter, and probably the first few, depending on how well they go. And, if they are going to go well, we'll play some of the excerpts in the in-print meetings so that people can get an idea of what it's all about. So let's get back to the slideshow here. So if you've become an interviewer, here are the practical matters you need to talk about. Each show is about an hour long, and that can be between 45 minutes and 60 minutes long. No shorter than 45, no longer than 60. The interviews need to have at least one guest. Okay, so unfortunately, you cannot talk to yourself. You can have a maximum of 4 guests, and the maximum there is just because that happens to be the number of microphones I own. The interviews should be 15 minutes at minimum, okay? Because like I said, each show has to be at least 45 minutes long, and so What I need to do from a practical situation as the producer of the show, I need to take a 15-minute interview and locate other people who have done other shorter interviews and combine them together to make one show. And the less I have to do that, the happier I will be. And believe me, it isn't that hard to do a 15-minute interview. When I was practicing this with my son, who is 13 years old, with very little preparation, in fact, none of the stuff that I'm going to talk about throughout this slideshow presentation, he managed to just talk to me and interview me for about 35 minutes. So I offer that as, it's okay. You'll be able to get through this. And towards that end, you may find somebody who is very, very interesting. If so, you don't have to cut the interview short. Talk to them as long as possible, as long as they're interesting and they've got things to say. I have plenty of space on my computer's hard drive to record the interview. What we'll do is we'll cut it in pieces so that it's a 2-part show, 3-part show, 27-part show, whatever it ends up being. From a practical standpoint, I do need to set up the equipment prior to the interview when your people are there and situated. So this includes setting the microphone on a stand, plugging it in into the board. I'll ask you to speak from where you're going to be sitting and what position you're going to be sitting and that sort of thing to make sure that all the levels sound good. And while these are going to be recorded, consider them a live thing. Okay, so if you do flub a line, that's okay. People flub all the time. In this recording that you're going to hear today, if I haven't flubbed already, I'm sure I will at some point. You just keep on going. There are no do-overs. So let's get into the practical matters of being an interviewer. Step 1, find someone to interview. Okay? Hopefully this is the obvious. But above and beyond finding somebody that's interesting and is interested to talk to you, we also have to figure out when and where the interview can be held. And this has to be confirmed with the producer, me, because I have the equipment. I have to be able to set up someplace. The where has to have electricity. I do have an extension cord, so I do need access to an outlet somewhere. A small table that can fit a laptop and a small box about 1 foot square. So it doesn't have to be a large table, but I do need something to set it up. It does have to be somewhere reasonably quiet. I would not recommend recording outside because of wind. But if you want to record somewhere like a restaurant, just make sure it's a bad restaurant with really bad service, because we don't want to be interrupted. That is probably more important than the quiet, how quiet a place is. We don't want people interrupting from outside and stopping the flow of the interview. If you want to do these in your own home and you have a family or spouse, kids, a dog, whatever, before we do the interview, it'd be a good idea for them to all, go get ice cream or something for a couple of hours while we interview your guest. The second thing is once we've figured out this is who I'm going to talk to, it's a good idea to know your subject. Be able to talk to them about the things that you want to talk about their writing. Read their writing, read their book, their articles, their blog postings, whatever that they have, to make sure that you're familiar with it, and write down questions as you go through. I recommend using index cards, but whatever makes sense for you, and plan to have about 1 question per minute. And if you run into some problems coming up with these questions, it is okay to talk to your subject ahead of time. Okay, this is not 60 minutes. We're not ambushing our guests and trying to make them confess to some crime. Okay, this should be a relaxed conversation for both the interviewer and the interviewee. We're just sitting tell me about your book, tell me about how you wrote your book, tell me about your journey as a writer, tell me all the things that you think might be important for other writers to understand, and therefore will listen to this interview. Okay. It is important that you avoid being timely. So don't say things like, my book is coming out next week, because while we're recording this as if it were live, it really is not live. And since we have to have 10 shows at the very beginning before we get an air date, those first few shows may be a month or more out before they actually get played back. So it is important, don't say things like, well, it's today is the 4th of July or something, because it may or may not be the 4th of July when this actually airs. The other thing is, and we'll talk a little bit about this more when we talk about different types of shows that we can do for the in-print radio show, we may ask to do separate, smaller mini interviews at the end of your main interview. It may touch on things you've already talked about, but these would be pieces that we can use as clips in a themed based show. So for example, I've just interviewed Charles Dickens, and I've talked to him all about all the books he's written. Then at the very end I'd say, Mr. Dickens, I'd really like to, we're doing a clip show later on for Christmas. I was wondering if I could ask you a couple of questions about A Christmas Carol specifically, even though I know we already talked about it. Let's just talk about that, and then that 5 minutes goes into the Christmas show. So now we're actually in the interview, getting ready to go. You're sitting with your guest. You've gotten them a glass of water or something so that they can relax. You've explained what's going on. You've read their books. Got a big stack of note cards full of questions, and we're ready to start recording. It's a good idea to have an introduction. Thank your guest. You have a lead-off question. Something like, thank you, Charles Dickens, for being here with me today. I really want to get right into it. Most of the novels that I've read from yours really take place in London, but I noticed your new novel, Tale of Two Cities, it takes place during the French Revolution. Why did you change that? Did you just get sick of writing about London? What was going through your mind? What inspired you to write this new novel? The questions should never be longer than the answers. Okay, so if I had that whole question, thank you very much, Charles Dickens, for coming here today. I really liked your book, Tale of Two Cities. It's a fantastic book. Did you get to help design the cover? And he says yes or no. You've now listened to me for 2 minutes explaining the question, and you heard Charles Dickens for 2 seconds. And while I hope you're listening to me, who would you rather hear, the interviewer, or would you rather hear the interviewee? And so that's the thing that you have to keep in mind, is keep your questions relatively short, or if they do have to be long, make sure that the answer you're going to get is going to be even longer. Okay? While you do have a stack of cards or a number of questions, make sure you're following the conversation. Okay? This is a key to a really good interview, is to make sure that if we start going down a different path than I had thought the interview would go, but it's still relevant about how he wrote a book, and he went here to do this, and he did that, and it's all extremely interesting. I want to know more about these things. They're not on my list of questions, and that is perfectly okay, because now you've got the interviewer interested, and you have the interviewee excited, and the people listening love it. Okay, up to a point. And that point is, make sure that, remember, this show has to be about writing. And so you're talking to a human being that, even if they are a writer, even if they are a professional writer, they do have other loves in their life, other interests in their life. They want to talk about their favorite sports team, their dog, the politics or religion or things like that. That's fine if it has something to do with their writing. If it does not, then it's really important to say, well, that's very interesting. I'd like to get back on track and talk about where do you think writing, where do you think a writer's place is in changing society, and then get back into where you're going. Okay. Finally, what you want to do is wrap up the interview at some point and have a concluding question. You know, and then thank the guest. So something like, it's been great talking with you today, Charles Dickens. I just want to end on this note. 100 years from now, 200 years from now, do you think that your work will still be relevant, or are you hoping that things like poverty and the class system in England that you write about so harshly today, that those things are gone and have been gone for so long that you're only remembered as a footnote? I mean, do you have any feeling either way on that situation? That's obviously something that he could talk about for a few minutes. And at the very end of that, you just say, well, thank you very much for being with us. Charles Dickens, he's a writer based in London, England. His books are available on Amazon.com. And we're done with the interview. By the way, if you can get Charles Dickens in an interview, by all means do. I'm a big fan. So afterwards, you need to write an introduction. And the introduction needs to be, will be done by the narrator of the show itself, because your piece will be a recording, and you can think of it sort of as your recording, your interview is a song, and so the framework will be the DJ. A good example of this would be, say, Fresh Air on NPR, and so there'll be a framework where it says, this is the name of the show, cue the theme song. And then they have a brief introduction, and this is what you would write. We would say something like, Charles Dickens, a very famous writer from Victorian England, imprints Bob Francis sat down with Dickens to talk to him about writing his latest book. And then it cuts into the interview we just did. If there needs to be an outro, that means after the interview is done, just to have something to say afterwards. Shortly after this episode, shortly after this interview, Charles Dickens went back to England and wrote a new book or something. I mean, you could, if you need to explain something afterwards, that's fine. Okay. One thing you do have to be careful with. The Rockford College Radio and Live 365 in general, they're not ad-based. They are not for profit. And so therefore, you can't be a commercial and say, Charles Dickens, his books are available at Barnes & Noble. They're $11.95 for the new book, and so on. You can't do that. Okay, what we have to just talk about is the writing, talk about that they have written a new book, and assume that the listener is smart enough and interested enough in your guest that they will seek them out and look for their book. Wow, that book, Tale of Two Cities, boy, that sounds interesting. I might want to pick that up. You might want to. It's a pretty good book. And we will gather that information because we will put it out on our website with a link to the podcast. And also, if Charles Dickens, if charlesdickens.com, that's his personal place where he sells copies of his novel, he of course can put links to the podcasts as well. So let's turn the tables. Okay, we've talked about being a good interviewer. Now let's talk about being a good interviewee. Okay, how to be a good guest. It is totally okay to help the interviewer out. Okay, it is totally okay to talk to them ahead of time. The only thing that I would suggest is that you do not absolutely practice the entire interview. You can think about the questions you're going to answer, but don't say them word for word, and whatever you do, please don't write anything down because it'll sound very forced and flat. If you have a copy of your book or your articles, whatever you have, it's okay to give that stuff to the interviewer ahead of time so they can offer it. If you have certain points you'd like to cover or certain anecdotes that you'd like to tell, you've just written this great memoir and you really think the strongest piece is your childhood growing up in, war-torn England. Great. Mention that. Say, I really have a lot of good stories that I can tell. Most are in the book, but, I have a few that I want to talk about. Be sure to bring that up. They may or may not get to it, but you've at least given them the choice and the understanding that, oh, yeah, that's good information to know. Let me steer the conversation that way. Are there excerpts of your book or your articles that would help start or end an interview, or things that would lend themselves to certain points? Make sure you have those bookmarked in your book when you have a chance to read. It's really important that when you're speaking in this, that you should smile. Okay? And see if you can hear the difference between these two. Thank you, Charles Dickens, for being here. Thank you, Charles Dickens, for being here. If you could hear the difference, I was smiling in one and not smiling in the other. And I'll bet you could hear the difference, and if you know which way I went. I'm not going to tell you, by the way. Also, make sure, as a guest, be a guest with interesting things to say. Do not be a commercial. Okay? Again, like I just reiterated with the interviewer, we'll get that information about your website. We'll get that information so you can have a link, and we'll be in touch when it becomes a podcast or it's actually going to be aired, so you can update your own social media and things like that to make sure people are listening. But we'll be driving you to them based on how interesting you are and the things you have to say. Okay, so this is a chance to sell yourself, and by selling yourself as a writer, it will hopefully sell your book or make you more saleable as an author. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about reading on the air. Okay. If you're the writer, I need you to provide 2 copies of your work. Okay, one for the person reading it. If that's you, fine. If it's somebody else, you have a copy for them. And you also have to have one for the producer. Okay, you have to provide an introduction and an optional outro. Again, this is for the framework of the show to say, it's Halloween, and what better way to start with a spooky story? In Prince, Bob Francis has this spooky tale, and then we cut into it. Now, as a reader, it's a good idea to prepare the text to make sure, what words am I going to stress? Where am I going to be able to take a breath? Are there loud sections? Are there quiet sections? Is there music and sound effects? If so, where do they go? Okay, and let me show you. I took a piece of one of the stories I wrote. This is just a quick at the very top. And so you can see I marked it all up, and there's a very good reason for a lot of this. I'll get into the sound effects and the music in a little bit more detail later. But basically it started with the dogs, and then there's a double line. That tells me that that's a good place for me to take a breath. And if you don't denote these throughout your writing, you may find yourself talking and 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 talking, and all of a sudden you have to go and then you can keep on going, and that point may be somewhere where you don't want it to be. Okay, so in this case I could say it started with the dogs. Hopefully you wouldn't breathe that hard into the microphone, but you get the idea. The words I have underlined, those are the ones that I'm going to put a little bit more stress in. The next night, it was quiet, as opposed to the next night, it was quiet. I have a line on top tying these words together. So if you play music, for example, those are like three notes you try to play together. Same idea. So I wouldn't say every dog in Forest Glen Estates. This is the name of where the characters live, so it's all together. Every dog in Forest Glen Estates howled away into the wee hours the night of the 12th. The next night it was quiet. So it gives you an idea of how you should be reading, what the flow of it is, because you may not know what the flow is just by looking at this in straight paragraph format. Okay? And the flow is extremely important for when you're doing narration. For the other pieces, it started with the dogs. I felt that I needed a sound effect, and I wanted a sound effect of dogs barking at night. So you get this idea that you can hear these dogs barking in the background, and then I describe what's going on. And then by here out, I'd completely fade it out because the next night it was quiet, right? The other thing is I thought after that it was the children. I want to get an idea that this is going to be sort of a spooky story, so I wanted to find a spooky sounding piece of music that would fit there. And so I'll show you where you find these and how you write them down a little bit later in the presentation. Move that off. So when you're ready to read on the air, you go ahead, you print it out, you've marked it all up. Now you have to go and practice it. Please, please, please practice it. Okay? Practice sitting versus standing. Personally, I think it sounds better if you're standing up. Okay? To a point, you can walk a little bit. It just depends on how comfortable you are. But in general, I find if you're standing up, you have a little bit more air and the ability to breathe easier than if you're kind of hunched over. Okay? But again, practice that and see what you're more comfortable with. Read about half as fast as you think you should. Okay? And if I've been talking too fast throughout this, I do apologize because personally I still fall into that trap as well. If I was reading this out loud, this story, bring it back over here. If somebody has the text in front of them, then they can follow along with their eyes and reinforce what I'm saying. So I can, if you have this in front of you, I can read it as, it started with the dogs. Every dog in Forest Glen Estates howled away into the wee hours the night of the 12th. The next night it was quiet. The cats vanished the following week. Roy Jenkins mentioned his Fluffy was missing, in between bragging about his lawn. All the animals were gone by the 21st. No birds, no mice, no bugs. After that, it was the children. And because I've been reading it pretty fast, but you've been reinforced by being able to read along with it. If I take this away and read that fast, you would not catch every word because your brain needs to process what you've just heard before it can go on to the next word. In that case, you need to read it slower. Read about half as fast as you think you should. Okay? So in this case, I would read it, since it's not on the screen, I would read it more like this. It started with the dogs. Every dog in Forest Glen Estates howled away into the wee hours the night of the 12th. The next night it was quiet. The cats and if you goof up, that's okay. The cats vanished the following week. Roy Jenkins mentioned his Fluffy was missing, in between bragging about his lawn. All the animals were gone by the 21st. No birds, no mice, no bugs. After that, it was the children. Because I'm reading it slower, it allows your brain to stay caught up. Okay? The other thing to remember is it's okay to use hand gestures. Now, if mercifully, there hasn't been a webcam tracking me as I've been doing this. And hopefully you've been able to hear my hand gestures. If I just stand here, I'm putting my hands behind my back, and I just read, and that's okay. And I say, hey, you over there, I need something from you. Okay, now if I do it with hand gestures, hey, you over there. Yeah, I need something from you. You can hear that in my hand gestures. You can hear them on the radio. Isn't that interesting? And you'll hear your body language on the radio just as much as you hear your smile. Finally, a couple of things to remember. Please don't be embarrassed by this. It is okay to walk around a little bit, use hand gestures, smile, do whatever you need to do. And if you are embarrassed, it's fine. We can work around that. One, it's radio. No one's ever going to see you. Okay. Two, we can move the equipment is portable. So we can do this from the privacy of your own home, and already it's quiet and people aren't going to interrupt you. So you've already sent everybody out of the house to go get ice cream. You can just go ahead and go nuts and give it your all. We probably if you want we can wire up your bathroom and run the cable under the door and shut the door. So in any case, whatever it takes for you to be comfortable doing this, that's fine, okay? It's important that you do that because the more that you can put into your writing, the better it will sound on the air. Finally, if you do have profanity in your story or whatever, it is okay. However, the Rockford College Radio does follow terrestrial radio standards, even though it's not on terrestrial radio. They still have the 7 deadly words that you can't say. So instead of interrupting the flow or having you go through and edit and say, fudge and all that kind of stuff instead, go ahead, say the F word, go ahead, say whatever you want to say, and it will be bleeped or cut out in post-production. Because we are recording this, so I'll go through and find where you said the F word, and I'll cut out the part of it so that we will not bother anybody about it. And that way we can have these links and we don't have to worry about having links to it on the imprint site where somebody younger might get it and people would be mad. Okay. So now let's talk about writing for the radio specifically. Okay, so again, you would write an intro and an outro, and especially if it's something like a radio show where, say, there's a continuation from week to week to week, like the old serials on the radio used to be. That intro might be something like, in our last episode, so-and-so, was caught in the mine, and the evil bad guy was lighting the dynamite. So that gives you an idea where this is going. Now we cut into the show. Same thing for the outro. Will the bad guy get away? Tune in next week. Understand that this is all an active voice. Nobody wants to hear passive voice on the radio, and the main reasons for that is because it's pretty much all dialogue. Okay, so you can have a narrator, for example, but the narrator is still speaking too. Okay, you need to write it out as a script and include the music and the sound effects, and it's okay to break it out similar to what I did for the reading. So if you do have a script, it still may need you to think about where you're going to put your breathing, what words you're going to stress, and it's okay to mark it up. The other thing when writing about is it's okay not to describe everything. Okay, so for example, I'm not going to say, I walked up to the door and knocked on the door. Well, that's silly because you can hear me knocking on the door. So why don't I just say, I walked up to the door. Hey, is anybody in there? Okay, you've just saved a couple of words of dialogue, and it sounds like you're really doing it as opposed to talking about doing it. Okay. The same thing with music. Music is good to get an emotion across. So if you, instead of writing all your characters, gee, I think I should be scared. Instead of writing that, find yourself a nice eerie piece of music and have that underneath what people are saying. So you have something, You don't have to write, boy, I'm sure scared. This house really is scary. Um, they'll get the idea just by listening to the music and understanding the mood that it's in. What you need to do from a practical standpoint is make enough copies for everyone to read. So if you have 10 characters in your radio show, make 11 copies. One copy for all 10 people to read, and then one for your producer. Couple things to keep in mind. We do have some voice talent people. If anybody's good at making voices, doing accents, that sort of thing, it's good to know, let us know that, or if you want to try it, that would be fun too. Just so people know when they're writing these things, maybe they can script something with you in mind. Okay? And I do plan to record everyone to read at once. So even if you have 10 characters and we don't have enough microphones, what we can do is stand up the microphones. People can go in and out as they need to speak. Because I think it's going to be important, especially since most likely none of us are trained actors or voice talent, that we need each other to interact with, especially in something like this where we're having dialogue. I'm talking to so-and-so and they're talking back to me. That's a whole lot easier to do if they are really there talking back to me. Okay? Finally, let's talk about the technical side of things. I do need some help on the technical aspects. I will be the producer of the show, and so my responsibility will be to record your interviews, your writing, and so on. If they need to be done any post-production, things like bleeping out the F word or adding music or sound effects, I'll go ahead and do that piece. I will also have a master collection of all these pieces and the times, and then be trying to assemble them if they're short. Where can, two 15-minute interviews and a 15-minute reading fit together? That becomes a show. Here's a 30 minutes plus a 15-minute reading. That's a show. Here's a 2-hour show. I'm going to break that in half and call that a 2-part show. Those are the things that I'll be doing. But I do need some help with that. Okay, so if anybody has any experience in journalism, and I know that a number of our imprint people are journalists or were journalists in the past, we could use your help to help the folks that are doing the interviews come up with good questions, come up with a good flow. That's something. If and our guests too. So if you're a journalist, it would be good to talk to find a guest and help them through it and draw out the best the guest can be. If you have any technical production experience, so if you worked at your college radio station, if you have equipment at home, nowadays a computer, the stuff that we're using to record this, the microphones I owned previous, but the computer recording equipment is part of my laptop, and it records pretty well. It's CD quality. So you may have some of this already, and if you kind of know how to use it, great. We can help you record. You can help us record segments as well. To get the stuff going to the WRCR studio, that's part of the producer's job too. Basically, once I have this 45 to 60 minute file, okay, this WAV file or MP3 sound file, what I need to do is go over to WRCR Studios and put it into their computer system so that it shows up on the schedule correctly, and it will be aired, Saturday at 2 o'clock, and then it will be converted into a podcast. Right now, I don't know how to do that. They offer training for that, and so I feel it's important that we at least have one co-producer, and I'd like at least maybe 2 or 3 co-producers, so that if I'm sick or something, the show will still go on. We'll still have that file. All I need to do is give it to you, and you know how to do it as well. So if you're interested in that, have some computer experience, or are just curious on how to do it, you've never done it before, that's okay. Maybe you learn something new. It might be fun. Finally, if you are interested in this, but you feel that, boy, I really don't feel comfortable interviewing anybody. I haven't really written anything good enough to be a guest. In my opinion, I don't think I'd be a good guest. I stumble a lot like I am right now, and so I don't think I could read anything, and I really don't want anybody reading my stuff because I'd feel embarrassed. And technical, I look at a computer and a blue screens. Guess what? There's still a place for you at the radio show if you want to help volunteer, because we do need people skills to help with behind the scenes. Just for things like helping out with interviews, calling around, organizing things. Where are good places that we can conduct these interviews? Hey, I live just down the street from the library. I can go over there and sign up the thing, because you have to sign up in person. For me, I live in Belvedere and I have to drive all the way to Cherry Valley to sign up. Maybe you live closer. Maybe you know of a good restaurant where they have really bad service and they never come to the table, but there's a plug right underneath the booth. We can plug in there and do an interview there. Might be fun. So things like that can help out to make the show run smoother. We are going to need people like that. And so if you're good at that sort of thing, if you do that for other groups, if you do it for In Print, for example, please, by all means, let me know. What we've been talking about up to this point, I think, are going to be the types of shows we're going to do at the get-go. So we'll be doing interview shows where we interview writers. We're going to do readings because all of us write stuff that can be read, hopefully. Like maybe somebody wants to write their own material for radio. That's great. What other ideas do we have out there? And so a couple of these I put down as just maybe some ideas. If you have some new idea, great. It's important that really the only definition we have is the show has to be about writing in some way. And so other than that, sky's the limit. One of the things I thought of is a roundtable discussion. So we do have the ability to have multiple guests. Maybe 3 or 4 science fiction writers. Maybe it'd be fun to get them all together and just have them talk about the state of science fiction writing these days, or how they all got inspired, or talk about the writing of pulp fiction back in, say, the 30s versus the 50s versus the 70s versus today, or something. Like I mentioned, theme shows. We do a Christmas show at Christmas where we've clipped together those additional interviews. Maybe we do clips of people reading works that make some kind of thematic sense. So like I said, anything you can think of, I'm willing to try. The one thing that I would say at this time we'd have to be careful with is phone interviews for remote guests. While we can do those, there's a couple of issues. One is a telephone doesn't have very good quality in terms of the sound. And so most of the time people would not want to sit for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour listening to somebody talking on the phone, because it's just going to not sound very good. Okay? If you're going to do a remote piece like that, probably the best thing to do would be we could set up a what's called a conference call using something like Skype or other computer-based phone system, where they have a microphone and a headset which has better quality than the little microphone inside a regular telephone or on a cell phone. However, that having been said, that does require there's some technical skills on both sides of the phone conversation. Okay, so they already need to know how to use Skype. They already need to have the headphones and how to adjust their sound and things like that. If you do have somebody in mind who does know how to do all that stuff, you know what? Great. We can record their conversations actually using the same technology I'm using to do this slideshow right now. Okay, so like I said, I'm not completely averse to it, but there are some challenges that you'd have to think about before doing it. So let's talk a little bit about resources. Now, normally, when you have a sound effect or you want to use music, you do have to be very careful in selecting those, because most of those things are copyright. Okay, and copyright law, as strange as it is, I mean, it can be problematic. So that's why, for example, if you write a story about the 60s, please don't put a Beatles track in the middle of it, okay? Because the reality is that they have certain rights, and you might end up having to have to pay a lot of money to, the surviving Beatles and their, the estates and things in order to play that. Maybe not, but as you've seen, no doubt if you've been on YouTube, you'll notice every so often that you can't play a certain piece because it's violated some law somewhere in copyright land, and now it's being prevented from being aired. So that's why we're not going to use, as much as I'd like to, we can't use the Beatles. We can't use names like that, unfortunately. However, people have recognized this. And so there are two very, very good sites. There's many more, but the two we're going to talk about today, where you can find sound effects and you can find music to be used, what's called production music, based on what's called the Creative Commons license. And the Creative Commons license means that these are people who are willing to let you use their stuff in any way you want. The only thing you have to do is write down the name of the piece, who did it, and we have to mention them in the credits. Okay? The two sites that we're talking about is the freesound.org, and that's primarily sound effects. And so let me bring that up. And so the way this works is that the Freesound, which is freesound.org, you can go ahead and browse for sounds, and if you're looking for something specifically, okay, so for example, in my story, it started with the dogs, and I wanted to have some barking dogs. So I can type in the search, barking dogs. And now I have all sorts of samples here of types of dogs barking. And so I can just test and see what they sound like. And actually what I did was I found that I wanted something that sounded, like a lot of dogs, and I wanted them to be barking at night. And so I found this one. And so when I found that one, what I did was I made a note of what name it was and the person, believe it or not, their name is E330. Okay? And so when I put this into my piece, I said, okay, number one is from freesound.org. Here's the name of the file, and it should go right before I start talking. So you'll hear that woof, 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 and then you'd hear me saying it started with the dogs. The same thing with the music. Now the music is available. There's a site called Incompetech. And if you select on royalty-free music, and then we can do a full search. And they're based on genre. So if you're writing a horror story, perhaps you look under horror. You can look under a type of feel, for example. If you want a mysterious feel, go ahead and search by feel and see what comes up. And there's all these different ones that may be mysterious, and then I kind of explain it a little bit. So you could say, okay, this one's more action oriented, let's play it. Well, that sounds pretty mysterious to me. What about this one? Yeah, that sounds pretty mysterious too, in a different way. And so you can go through and figure out which one fits your needs. And so, let's see, I found a piece called Measured Paces. And so this is what I had in mind, and I wrote it down here. You know, it started with the dogs. That's where my number one is, where it's going to play this Night Dogs from Freesound. And after that, it was the children, and that's where I would like you to start putting in measured paces. So if I say, all the animals were gone by the 21st. No birds, no mice, no bugs. And after that, it was the children. So you get the idea of how I want it to sound. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're doing this is if they're loud, don't worry about the loudness, that can be controlled. But you want to be careful with the amount of melody when you're doing this. What that means is if it has a really driving melody, that's going to act like a voice, and it can be competing with your own voice. So you don't want to have that to talk over. If you're going to find that you're going to be talking over something for a while, you probably want something that doesn't have much of a melody. So like this might be a little bit hard to talk to because it's really, it's really a hard thing to talk over because it's da 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 da. That sounds like a voice. It's competing. Where something like this might be a little bit easier to talk over, especially if it was a little quieter. Anyway, so that is just some recommendations that you can do, and not everything is, the zombie stuff. You can find quite a lot of other things on here. This guy, Kevin MacLeod, who does all of this, he's from Wisconsin, and he does professional scoring for music. And when he's done with them, he puts them out here, and there's about 1,000 right now, and he's adding new ones usually about once every week or so of new pieces of production music. So this is a really good resource. Free sound, there's got to be close to 1 million different types of sounds, so you can really find a lot of things that you want to find. And it's also interesting, you may find it interesting from a technical perspective of how they put them together. If you click on these, it'll actually give you more information of what they did to make the sound. And so if you look up something like, monster, for example, most likely they didn't find a real monster because for some reason they're actually kind of scarce in reality, and they don't like to be recorded. So you can actually read how they got these different sounds. Yikes. So you can go in here and say, well, that's actually this guy's voice. He pitch shifted it, which he meant he turned it really low, and apparently he did some other stuff with it. And, gives you an idea of what it sounds like and how it works. And again, we just need to know what it's called so I can locate it when I'm doing it, the production of it. And you can just write down, here's the website. It was called Measured Paces. This one was Free Sound, and it was called this, Night Dogs. And that's where I'll know where to put them and what to download and so on. So there's a few things that we need to keep in mind going forward as a practical part. We don't have a good name for the show. Basically, at this point, it's probably just going to be called In-Print Radio, which is okay. I think that sounds good. Do we have a tag? If anybody has any better ideas, please let me know, because I'd like to have it and have something that everybody can agree on. The other thing is we're going to have a theme song, and so in the next few weeks, I plan to put out a poll out on the website, and I'll let people know so they can vote on the potential theme song for the show. The reason that we need to do this is so then for the people who are going to pick other music, make sure you don't pick that song, because that is the theme song to Imprint, which can't be used. Everything else can be used, leaving you, 999 other pieces of music to use. So after all that, who's ready to start? If you have somebody already in mind, give them a call, find out, give me a call, and let me know. Okay? We need to really start doing this, and we have to do one a week as long as the show is on the air. Okay? So let me know what your ideas are. As soon as you have a time and a place figured out, we'll try to figure it out. Primarily, I can do nights and weekends just because I have a day job. If we need to, we can set up a conference call. If you have multiple people that we have to try to figure this out, that's fine. Follow-up phone calls and emails, that will be important too. And so if you do need to get a hold of me, this is the best way as of right now, admin@imprintwriters.com. And so I'll be following up with that, and then I will follow up with each and every one of you as we go through this. So you have my phone number if you need to get a hold of me. My number is in the newsletters. I really don't want to give it out here, being that this is going to be posted to YouTube, but you can get a hold of me in multiple ways, and I strongly urge you to do so. And that is pretty much everything I have for today and for the presentation. We did a question and answer period, and I tried to accommodate as many of those that I could remember from Saturday's show. But if you do have other questions, please do get in touch with me and let me know. If you have other ideas and the things that you've heard about today just don't fit, hey, that's okay. There's plenty of room for this. We're just starting out. And so if this goes in other directions, because those are what the interests of the members of Imprint wanted to go, that is totally okay with me. So I'm looking very forward to this, and I know a number of you are excited, and I hope you're excited about this as well. And I really think this is going to be a positive experience, no matter how you are involved. If you're an interviewer, it'll help you organize your thoughts, help you maybe do more research for a piece that you yourself are going to be writing. If you're a guest, if you can do a good hour on Imprint, imagine how great you're going to sound when you get on NPR or other shows. If you write for the radio or if you read for the radio, that opens up a lot of markets, right? If you're technical, they're always looking for technical stuff. That's especially in this day and age. If you know how to use a computer or things like that, you're going to use it for something. So in any aspect that you get involved with this, I really think it'll be a benefit for you. And I'm really looking forward to working with all of you. So from that, please turn this off and get going, get writing, go find your interviews, go be your guests, and so on. And I'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye. Already, I'm sure I will at some point. You just keep on going. There are no do-overs. So let's get into the practical matters of being an interviewer. Step 1, find someone to interview. Okay, hopefully this is the obvious. But above and beyond finding somebody that's interesting and is interested to talk to you, we also have to figure out when and where the interview can be held. And this has to be confirmed with the producer, me, because I have the equipment. I have to be able to set up someplace. The where has to have electricity. I do have an extension cord, so I do need access to an outlet somewhere. A small table that can fit a laptop and a small box about 1 foot square. So it doesn't have to be a large table, but I do need something to set it up. It does have to be somewhere reasonably quiet. I would not recommend recording outside because of wind. But if you wanted to record somewhere like a restaurant, just make sure it's a bad restaurant with really bad service, because we don't want to be interrupted. That is probably more important than the quiet, how quiet a place is. We don't want people interrupting from outside and stopping the flow of the interview. If you want to do these in your own home, and you have a family or spouse, kids, a dog, whatever, before we do the interview, it'd be a good idea for them to all, go get ice cream. The happier I will be. And believe me, it isn't that hard to do a 15-minute interview. When I was practicing this with my son, who is 13 years old, with very little preparation, in fact, none of the stuff that I'm going to talk about throughout this slideshow presentation, he managed to just talk to me and interview me for about 35 minutes. So I offer that as, it's okay. You'll be able to get through this. And towards that end, you may find somebody who is very, very interesting. If so, you don't have to cut the interview short. Talk to them as long as possible, as long as they're interesting and they've got things to say. I have plenty of space on my computer's hard drive to record the interview. What we'll do is we'll cut it in pieces so that it's a 2-part show, 3-part show, 27-part show, whatever it ends up being. From a practical standpoint, I do need to set up the equipment prior to the interview when your people are there and situated. So this includes setting the microphone on a stand, plugging it in into the board. I'll ask you to speak from where you're going to be sitting and what position you're going to be sitting and that sort of thing to make sure that all the levels sound good. And while these are going to be recorded, consider them a live thing. Okay, so if you do flub a line, that's okay. People flub all the time. In this recording that you're going to hear today, if I haven't flubbed. Hi, my name is Bob Francis, and this is a broadcast of the talk I gave at the May 11th in-print meeting at the Cherry Valley Library. So if you did attend that meeting and did see me standing up there going through this presentation, it is okay to turn it off right now. For those of you who didn't see it, hopefully this will be a good introduction to what needs to happen now that you have volunteered for the in-print radio show that we're putting together. So when you signed up to be a volunteer for the in-print radio show, I asked what aspects of the show would you be interested in? Would you be interested in technical, being an interviewer, being a guest, reading your work, or reading someone else's work? And so we'll be going through all of those aspects, and what I expect you to do, give you some samples to hopefully start getting through the practical matter of actually doing our first interviews and our first shows. So let me show you where this is and what we've been asked to do. This is a website, and it's www.live-to-it from the in-print website. We'll be mentioning it in our Facebook feed. We'll probably mention it in the newsletter, and probably the first few, depending on how well they go. And if they are going to go well, we'll play some of the excerpts in the in-print meetings so that people can get an idea of what it's all about. So let's get back to the slideshow here. So if you've become an interviewer, here are the practical matters you need to talk about. Each show is about an hour long, and that can be between 45 minutes and 60 minutes long. No shorter than 45, no longer than 60. The interviews need to have at least one guest. Okay, so unfortunately, you cannot talk to yourself. Um, you can have a maximum of 4 guests, and the the maximum there is just because that happens to be the number of microphones I own. The interviews should be 15 minutes at minimum, okay? Because like I said, each show has to be at least 45 minutes long, and so what I need to do from a practical situation as the producer of the show, I need to take a 15-minute interview and locate other people who have done other shorter interviews and combine them together to make one show. And the less I have to do that, 365.com, then there's a place you can look up the radio stations. And in this case, this station is called Rockford College Radio. And this streams out live, so you could go ahead and play this right now. You can have an app on your phone, and you can listen to what's going on. This is the main website, which is www.rockfordcollegeradio.com. And we can look at the schedule here. What we're going to do is have a show. There we go. Sometime we'll have an hour-long show sometime in this area that we'll be having a show about writing. That has been what we've been asked to do. It has to do with writing. And other than that, anything goes. And so we'll have a show that'll show up somewhere in here. Then we'll be listed here and have a home page. You can click for podcast because once our show has aired in the day part, so if we're Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, after that, then it'll show up in the list of available podcasts. And you can see all the ones that are available. This is just on the RockfordCollegeRadio.com website. We'll also have links